So we're going to kind of change gears here, and we'll talk about just what we need for speech and communication. So like we said, speech is the oral form of language. That's mostly what we're going to talk about in this class when we talk about communication. It follows our language rules, and it's purely a physical process. So we talked about the word choice and everything being a mental process, and speech is a physical process. So once the motor command is sent from the brain to the mouth and the other speech effectors, it's a physical thing. The meanings and everything are already chosen by the time the motor program gets to the muscles. So it becomes something different. So what's necessary for spoken communication? Well, certainly a brain, right? I mean, if we're not talking about just the speech process, but we're talking about the choosing process as well, in that we need the brain. What else do you think we need? Maybe muscles of the jaw, muscles of the tongue, other things like that. I would agree. I would totally agree with these things that you've said. So yeah, you need the brain. It begins the process, right? So you start with an idea. This is kind of a frontal area thing. You have an idea here. So you've come up with a new thought and you want to tell everybody. So then you also have to begin the motor production. Not only do you come up with the thought, but you select the words, which is done in a few different areas. And then you begin motor production, which is done along the motor strip here and in Broca's area right here. Then that goes to the rest of the body. So we've done the cognitive portion of it, and now that's going to go elsewhere. What's also important is the lungs and respiratory muscles. The reason for that is that's your source. So one thing that you'll hear a lot about in this class and all of the others is the source filter model of speech, which means you have to have something that creates a sound source and something that filters the sound source into intelligible parts. Well, you need a sound source and a power source and a filter. The lungs are the power source. So you've got two lungs, they're going to fill up with air, and you're kind of hijacking the breathing process by putting the vocal cords in the way. And that creates the power source. The air is the power source for producing sound with the vocal folds, which is the sound source. So you need the lungs and the muscles of respiration. Those are important. The larynx and the vocal folds are important too. As you pull the vocal folds together, they create like this buzzing sound. And that is the sound source. So we've got power source, which is air in the lungs. We've got the sound source, which is the buzzing of the vocal folds. And then the mouth and the nasal cavity are going to shape the sound into identifiable words and phonemes and things like that. And that is the filter of the source filter model, which actually should be like a source filter model: power source, sound source, filter. So you need all these different things: a brain, a power source, a sound source, and a filter. And then we also are going to talk about hearing. What's necessary for hearing? Well, the outer ear, which is what kind of collects the sound. The middle ear transforms it from a wave out in the air to a fluid wave. The cochlea then transforms that fluid wave into a neural signal. That's in the inner ear. And then you need the brain again. You're going to recognize speech using this area. This is Wernicke's area, and various other areas in the brain. And then that process starts all over again, because you have to think about what you've heard, and then you generate another response. There's also, there's a little thing that I'm going to tell you. So very recently, a paper was published that says that Wernicke's area is nothing, essentially, in terms of speech and hearing. There's no use of the Wernicke's area. This is very recent, and it combines a lot of work from a whole bunch of other papers looking at what areas are used in speech recognition. And actually, even though we thought it was Wernicke's area, it seems like it's not. Now, you're going to hear things about Wernicke's aphasia. You're probably going to hear a lot about Wernicke's area as you go through your schooling. It's okay. It takes a lot of time for the textbooks to catch up with the research. And it also takes a lot of time for, your instructors are kind of put in a tough place of, well, the textbooks haven't caught up yet, but the new research is saying that Wernicke's area is nothing, so what do we teach? Do we teach what has just come out in the research? Do we teach what's in the textbook? Do we teach a little bit of both? So in this class, we're going to do a little bit of both. I'm going to tell you that it seems like Wernicke's area isn't anything anymore. It's a really distributed process, highly distributed process throughout the brain, and actually doesn't really involve Wernicke's area at all. But other classes, they might still hit Wernicke's area pretty hard. So just know it's a really complicated process. It involves a whole bunch of areas in the brain of speech recognition. One thing that we do know is still important, Broca's area. It's a really important area, and it overlaps with the motor strip. It's important for, it's actually important for interpreting sound as well, which is interesting. It's important for production, but it's also important for interpreting. And it's all the way up there towards the frontal regions, overlaps with the motor cortex, but it's important in interpretation. Other parts that we do know are important for interpreting sound are the primary auditory cortex, which is also called Heschel's gyrus, and the planum temporale. And that's all right here. So the auditory cortex right here, this is primary auditory cortex, also known as Heschel's gyrus. And that's the main place where sound is first processed. So the really basic building blocks of sound. Any musical sound, any noise, any speech, that's all processed in the Heschel's gyrus before it moves on elsewhere and is processed in different ways. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about is how we get from one to the other. So we went through the brain, and then we got to the mouth, and then we went to the ear. Well, the air is also a really important part of this whole thing. We are producing, the vocal folds in here are producing a sound pressure wave. It needs a medium to travel through. Remember, communication is information exchange across a medium, through a medium, whatever. And you need a medium. In space, you can't talk to another person. I mean, through a radio you can, but not just like face to face. The reason is there's no medium between you. So you can't have a sound pressure wave that travels through space because there's nothing to push on. There's no air, so you can't have a pressure wave. So the actual air that's all around us is a really important part of this entire speech and hearing thing that we're learning about. Because we're speaking and creating this sound pressure wave, and then the sound pressure wave is what's collected by our ear and turned into a signal that then we can interpret. We'll learn towards the end of the class about other ways that we don't have to have a sound pressure wave. I mean, there's some disorders, some hearing disorders that don't allow the sound pressure wave to work quite right. So there's other ways to get around it. But in general, with typical hearing, it's a sound pressure wave. And with typical speech, it's a sound pressure wave. So that's a very important part of this that we didn't include in this. But we'll talk about it when we talk about hearing and when we talk about the actual creation of the sound in the larynx. Okay, so the central nervous system is an important part of this as well. We're not going to focus on this too much. In fact, let's not focus on it at all. This is a long enough video the way it is. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so the cerebrum, the brain, is made up of a few different lobes. We've got the frontal lobe, which is going to be this part right here, well, including the motor cortex. So this kind of pink area right here. The parietal, which is going to be this bluish, purplish area right here. The temporal, yep, there we go. I moved my laser pointer way in the wrong area. So temporal is going to be this yellowish area right here. And then lastly, the occipital, which is this green area back here. Temporal is usually where we're processing sound. The early sounds that come in is temporal. Occipital is mostly vision. Frontal is a lot of our kind of decision making and thinking processes, and then parietal is kind of a lot of sensory integration. There's a lot of different things going on in the parietal lobe. There's a lot of different things going on in all of these lobes, but you can kind of break it down to some very basic things at this point. For an intro class, you can break it down into those. There's also a lobe called the insula. It's kind of hidden down in here behind the temporal lobe, kind of sandwiched behind the temporal lobe and kind of up inside the parietal lobe. And it is kind of functions more on visceral emotions and kind of like maybe more of those gut instinct kind of things like that. Not higher emotions, which are in the frontal area, but maybe those kind of more instinctual kind of emotions are processed in the insula, and possibly also some aspects of sound. We don't need to know about that. We're not going to do that. Okay, so what disorders can arise here? Different things. Oh, I don't have anything. So think about this. What disorders could possibly arise in the brain? What we've just talked about. Well, you could have a problem of coming up with what you actually want to say, and that could have issues here if you had damage here or birth defects or anything like that in the frontal area. This could affect maybe how you relate to others, maybe not being able to find the words, so Broca's aphasia. You could have problems in the temporal lobe from injury or birth defects again, and that could create deafness. If you had, like, let's say this part of the brain is injured, and that's a very specific kind of deafness. That's not age-related hearing loss, because that's a problem with the hair cells here. It would be a kind like a cortical deafness, which means there's actually something with the brain that's not being able to process the sound. If you had damage back here, you'd have vision problems. And then you can also have damage in areas here, possibly in these areas, that can affect your interpretation of sound. So you can hear the sound coming in just fine, which means your auditory cortex is okay, but the way that you're interpreting it is wrong. Or not wrong, but disordered. And that can create things like Wernicke's aphasia. So here's respiration. The diaphragm is our main muscle that we're talking about here, and that is going to regulate conversational speech. It's really the main thing that's coming into play when we're just talking regularly. The diaphragm contracts, it's going to pull down, so it's kind of a parachute-like shape that comes up like this, and when it contracts, it pulls down, and that allows air to rush in. And then you relax the diaphragm and air will come out. And that's your conversational speech. You have other muscles as well in the chest and the abdomen and the shoulders and even the neck. And those aid in breathing, like more heavy breathing, and also different kinds of talking. So if you're lecturing like I'm doing, you're probably taking in more breath than usual, so you're using more of these muscles of respiration, and you're also pushing out more air than usual too. So you're breathing beyond your bottom capacity, and that is also using some of those muscles as well. In terms of phonation, yeah, here we go. This is cool. We're going to talk about all of this later when we talk about anatomy, so I'm kind of like going through it very quickly. But these are vocal folds, and like I said, we hijacked this process, so we're going to close the vocal folds in the airstream that's coming out from our lungs, and that's kind of hijacking the breathing process to create sound. And this is what that looks like It's a very slowed down motion of the vocal folds. They're pushed together, and the air is kind of popping out between them. It's kind of like a trumpet mouthpiece, maybe like a clarinet reed, maybe like a guitar string. All of these vibrate just like the vocal folds do, and they create sound. And that's what we're doing with our vocal folds as well. We're going to watch this video later. It's really cool. So we produce the vibration of the vocal folds, is what creates the sound pressure wave that's necessary for speech. All right. And then we've got, like we talked about, resonance and articulation. This is all done in the above the larynx, above where the vocal folds are. So your pharyngeal cavity, which you can think of as your throat, and then also your mouth and your nasal passages. Those change the timbre of the sound. So pitch is changed by the larynx. Loudness is changed by how much air is coming out of the lungs. The timbre is changed by changing the shape of the mouth and the nasal cavity and the pharynx. You can do things like voice a sound versus not. So p versus b. P and b are very similar in terms of what's happening with the effectors, but not with the voicing. You can change the place. So you can do a t versus a k. And where that constriction is creates a totally different sound. So if the tongue is very far back in the mouth versus very front, very forward on the alveolar ridge of where the teeth are, t versus k. So all those different things are going to change up the way that sound sounds and creates different speech sounds. So what disorders can arise here? Well, if you have a muscle disorder with, in terms of breathing, if your breathing apparatus doesn't work quite right, you're not going to have very loud speech. You're going to have to take a lot of pauses while you're trying to talk to somebody, to breathe in after every couple words like that. And also might be very quiet if you can't push out a lot of air. So that's one type of problem in terms of respiration. If you had problems with phonation, if you weren't able to keep your vocal folds closed all the way, you might get a very breathy voice. So instead of just a regular, you might kind of end up with a like that. So there's air escaping aside from the sound that's being created. And then you can also have problems when your vocal folds are pressed too tightly together, and that can create like a creaky voice sound like that. You hear that a lot of times with Parkinson's, because they're trying so hard to keep the vocal folds together that they're kind of pushed too tight together, and then the sound kind of explodes out of there more forcefully than it does otherwise, and kind of creates like a creaky sound. And then in terms of effectors, if you have a problem with some of the effectors, you're not going to create the correct speech sounds. And that's definitely one of the things that probably you're familiar with if you've looked into, SLP work at all, especially in schools or with older people after strokes. That's where a lot of the issues come up, is with the effectors. So maybe they can't say, I've got a slight lisp myself. So that's one of the things that you might see. I don't say my S's quite correctly. So things like that. Hearing, which we'll talk about later. Again, sound waves reach the ear. The pinna aids in localization of finding where the sound actually is in space. The tympanic membrane will actually amplify and dampen the waves that travel through the air. So it can amplify up to 17 times a quiet sound. So it'll take a very quiet sound, amplify it 17 times so you can hear it. If it's a loud sound, it can tense up and not allow that to get into the inner ear as much as it would otherwise. So it does a little bit of both. Beyond that is the cochlea, which again transfers the sound pressure wave into a neural signal. And then your neural signal is going to go up to your brain again, up to the primary auditory cortex, and you're going to then interpret it. So what kind of problems can arise here? Well, like we talked about, you could have certain types of, depending on where this is, you can have reduction in hearing, so you're not able to hear as much. You can have complete deafness. You could have single-sided versus dual-sided deafness. You can have different kinds of deafness as well. You could also end up with, there's certain types of tumors that can lead to distortion of sound. So the hearing is okay, but the actual signal that gets to the brain is distorted because of some of these tumors, like acoustic neuromas. Again, we'll talk about those later. And that's where we're going to stop for this one as well.